More than 2,000 years ago, the great ancient Roman orator Cicero said, "The closer the collapse of an empire, the crazier its laws." All of subsequent human history only confirms this wisdom. Being on the brink of inevitable destruction, dictators of all times and nations have made completely illogical, sometimes even utterly absurd decisions. Neither the Nazi leaders, who sent 12-year-old boys from the Hitler Youth to certain death, nor the Kremlin rulers, who did everything possible to revive the half-dead patient called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, were exceptions. Although with each passing month of the Soviet regime's decay, it was clear to all reasonable people that this patient was doomed to a fatal outcome. In order to try to preserve the once mighty and fearsome totalitarian regime, the party elite resorted to all sorts of tricks to keep the empire from falling apart, to suppress the will of the people, to preserve that ugly prison of nations called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Today, we will be examining this problem, looking at the situation that led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and analyzing the countermeasures taken by Moscow. Both informational and propaganda measures, as well as outright repressive ones, which, by the way, bordered on war crimes for which the Gorbachev leadership never received the punishment it deserved. And finally, we will try to answer the question that interests many people. Was it possible to avoid violence and bloodshed in the situation that had developed? As always, I'll be concise and direct. I'm Semyon, and this is Mega Show Television. Let's start. For what purpose? Perestroika was conceived in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev, who had not yet fallen into senile dementia and still retained some common sense, came to power. Nothing hinted at the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse. For the next 6 years, the vast empire controlled not only 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, but also many other satellite states. In many parts of the world, they were then called countries of socialist orientation. You could find them in Europe, Asia, Africa, and even the lone Cuba, located just 200 kilometers from the coast of the United States of America. Moscow's influence on the world stage was enormous, especially considering the factor of nuclear weapons, which this Kremlin cavalcade loved to rattle ever since the days of Stalin. But that's just at first. In reality, by the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was in a deep crisis, which was not accidental or situational, but rather systemic in nature. For example, United States President Ronald Reagan persuaded the Arab monarchs of the Persian Gulf to significantly increase oil production, which led to a substantial drop in global energy prices. As a result, the main source of income for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which actually allowed it to maintain a relatively stable socio-economic situation in the country, was undermined. Plus, it became harder to sponsor many of its pro-Soviet puppets around the world who were not interested in building communism but rather in receiving generous aid from the Soviets. And this waterfall of unprecedented generosity turned into a small trickle, which clearly did not allow Moscow to fully realize its ambitions, and something had to be done about it, urgently. Otherwise, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would have dropped out of the ranks of superpowers purely for economic reasons. In fact, the solution to this difficult task fell on the shoulders of Gorbachev, to make the eternally unprofitable Soviet economy at least more or less self-sustaining and not so dependent on Western technologies. The Sovok was never able to produce anything equal to them, which is why it had to buy the necessary chips and microcircuits on the black market, or simply by stealing them in the most basic way. And to accomplish the set goal, it was necessary to carry out economic reforms and introduce market elements. I want to emphasize that when Perestroika began, neither Gorbachev nor anyone in his circle could even imagine democratizing the state, let alone giving the conquered nations the opportunity to go their own way. At first, it was only about the economy and nothing more. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was supposed to remain a super-centralized empire, where all power belonged to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And by the way, that strategy was quite effective. That's exactly what China did just a few years earlier. Its leader, Deng Xiaoping, carried out a series of successful reforms that made the Chinese economy completely market-oriented. However, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's dominance stayed unshakable, and this model remains nearly unchanged today. However, in the case of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, everything went a different way. The people woke up after a long hibernation. First, Perestroika had entirely unexpected effects politically. Glasnost and the easing of censorship led to works that were previously banned being published completely legally. Rybakov's Children of the Arbat, Bulgakov's Heart of a Dog, and Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. This is far from a complete list of the books that used to be brought in from abroad or typed out by hand on typewriters and read secretly under the covers, so that God forbid some ideologically correct neighbor wouldn't find out and report it to the KGB. Moreover, films appeared on the screen whose scripts in previous years would have been shut down even at the discussion stage. Malenkaya Vera, Igla, Interdevochka, Avaria, Dochmenta, Ubit Drakona Asa. Each of these films became a cult classic of its time, as they exposed and mocked the vices of Soviet reality, corruption, drug addiction, prostitution, social inequality, bureaucracy, and the tyranny of those in power. It also became possible to openly discuss historical topics that had previously been either completely forbidden or only superficially addressed. Stalin's repressions, famines, and mass deportations were briefly acknowledged, and as people realized the extent of past atrocities, they increasingly asked, if such horrors occurred before, how can we be sure we're living rightly now? Maybe everything is wrong and needs to change. Such a thought leads directly to political demands, protests, and struggle. And even in the economy, which Gorbachev prioritized, there was chaos. On one hand, elements of the market and private entrepreneurship were being introduced in the form of cooperatives, but on the other hand, there was nothing. The inconsistency and lack of foresight in many reforms led to a wave of lawlessness, racketeering, inflation, and a decline in the standard of living sweeping over the country. And people who were used to the traditional planned economy, the Kremlin bigwigs couldn't do anything to curb the unprecedented rise in prices or protect the first Soviet businessmen from the lawlessness of the cops and criminals. But the most important thing, which Gorbachev and his associates could not foresee, was the rise of national consciousness among the conquered peoples. Forcibly brought together as part of the unified union of Soviet socialist republics, they began to show defiance, refusing to obey the Kremlin and demanding more rights and powers for themselves. And the day was not far off when Latvians and Georgians, Moldovans and Lithuanians, Armenians and Estonians would rise up and say, "Down with Moscow, we can live on our own," when Moscow realized the seriousness of the situation. The Kremlin largely ignored early signs of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse, failing to recognize the national movement's rising power and influence. The members of the party elite, who were raised and grew up in the conditions of the indissoluble union of free republics, simply did not believe, for example, that Ukrainians or Kazakhs might want their own independent state. In their understanding, everything was supposed to happen exactly the opposite. All the peoples of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were supposed, in the end, to unite, to merge into a single Soviet people, as propagandists had been saying constantly since the days of Brezhnev. Today, it's unclear when Politburo strategists realized the Union might collapse entirely or partly. In any case, even in 1988-89, they still didn't take such a prospect seriously. An example of this is Moscow's extremely passive stance toward the conflict between Armenians and Azerbaijanis in Nagorno-Karabakh. At that time, Gorbachev clearly adopted a non-interference stance. The Soviet leadership acted in exactly the same way in May 1989 when bloody clashes broke out in Fergana between local Uzbeks and incoming Meskhetian Turks, which turned all of Uzbekistan upside down. However, Moscow was in no hurry to intervene in the conflict, deliberately downplaying its significance and pretending that all the peoples of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics continued to live in peace, friendship, love, and mutual understanding. Gorbachev was quite cautious about the processes known as the Parade of Sovereignties. Between 1988 and 1990, every single Soviet republic, without exception, adopted declarations of state sovereignty. The first example was set by Estonia, which sought greater decentralization of power and increased influence for local republican elites. Other republics followed its example. Ukraine, for instance, declared its sovereignty on July 16, 1990. It should be noted here that sovereignty is not full independence yet, but rather the first step towards it. At that time, sovereignty meant strengthening the autonomy of the Union republics, expanding their powers, and very importantly, establishing the priority of the republic's constitutions and laws over the Union laws. Simply put, for example, the constitution of Tajikistan or Azerbaijan became more important than the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics constitution. This approach greatly weakened Moscow's authority, but it wasn't seen as critical, at least not in the comfortable Kremlin offices. Can we leave or not? Gorbachev and his associates truly began to understand the reality of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse after their visit to the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. This visit by the General Secretary took place from January 11 to 13, 1990, and was accompanied by mass demonstrations by Lithuanians. More than 200,000 people gathered in the central square and chanted independence. No amount of persuasion about expanding self-government and economic independence worked anymore. One of the protesters' slogans against Gorbachev said, "Lenin recognized Lithuania, Stalin took away its independence, and Gorbachev..." And then, after the events in Vilnius, the Soviet leadership began to drastically change its policy. But not towards seeking compromise, dialogue, and mutual understanding, but towards preventing the peoples from exercising their right to self-determination at any cost. But in practice, it had the opposite effect. To begin with, however, the authorities decided to act through cunning, intrigue, and all sorts of legal sophistry. The fact is that both Clause 26 of the Treaty on the Creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics from 1922 and Article 72 of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics Constitution, adopted in 1977, provided for the free secession of any Union republic from the Union. Of course, the Soviet leaders who wrote these documents at the time never seriously expected that anyone would actually leave the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. To them, it seemed completely unthinkable. On the contrary, according to their plans, more and more new republics were supposed to join it until the whole world became Soviet. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' emblem intentionally included the globe. For formality, rights, and the appearance of voluntariness, each Union republic kept the right to freely leave the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, in the early 1990s, formality could become reality. And in order to prevent this from happening, Gorbachev hastily organized the drafting and adoption of a special legal act, which was supposed to detail the mechanism for leaving the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But in fact, it was meant to do everything possible to block such a process. And this document was the law on the procedure for resolving issues related to the secession of a Union republic from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics adopted on April 3, 1990, which made the secession procedure extremely bureaucratic, making it practically impossible in practice. Still, this didn't stop Litva. On the night of March 11, 1990, it unilaterally declared its independence, becoming the first of all the Soviet republics to do so. Moscow, of course, did not recognize this decision, but it still did not dare to suppress the freedom-loving Litvans by force, at least at that moment, instead imposing an economic blockade on the rebellious republic. Lithuania's bold, uncompromising move, once thought impossible just a year before, set an example for others, especially the other Baltic republics also annexed by Stalin in 1940. On May 4, Latvia declared its independence, and on May 8, Estonia did the same. The proud peoples of the Caucasus, conquered but never fully subdued by Russia, became the second stronghold of resistance to Moscow. Even in the early 19th century, on August 23, 1990, Armenia declared independence, never forgiving the Union Center for its inconsistent Karabakh policy. And on April 9, 1991, Georgia announced its withdrawal from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Its leader, longtime fighter against the Soviet regime Zviad Gamsakhurdia, was a staunch opponent of any compromises with Moscow, refusing even the format of maximum expanded autonomy. Only Azerbaijan remained on board, and even that was thanks to the openly pro-Russian position of its president Ayaz Mutalibov. Even so, the desire among ordinary Azerbaijanis to leave the Union kept growing. And the most interesting thing is that for almost a year, Gorbachev didn't lift a finger. To establish normal relations with these republics, to build equal and trusting relationships, instead of acting according to the outdated master-servant principle, there were no round tables, no negotiations, nothing like that. And yet, such measures had proven their effectiveness a year earlier in pro-Soviet countries of Eastern Europe, for example, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, which led to the fall of communist dictatorships, quietly, peacefully, and most importantly, completely without bloodshed. Gorbachev did nothing of the sort until March 1991. From TVs and radios, there was a constant stream of informational junk claiming that the republics themselves would not be able to survive without the brotherly help of generous and wealthy Russia. Propaganda was actively pushing the narrative that without Moscow's firm hand, poverty, devastation, and chaos would inevitably begin in the dependent countries. And this was despite the fact that extreme inflation and the decline in living standards had already begun before they left the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But the Kremlin's Goebbels kept quiet about that. Blood for freedom and independence. Having used the entire arsenal of persuasion, scare tactics, and propaganda cliches, Gorbachev decided to use violent methods to try to stop the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which by early 1991 had already become an absolute reality. And as you all guessed, he directed the main blow against the rebellious people of the Baltics. So, taking advantage of the fact that the security forces, interior ministry troops, and KGB units stationed in Lithuania largely continued to obey Moscow rather than the Lithuanian authorities, Gorbachev decided to restore full control over the rebellious republic, to deter others from doing the same. On the night of January 11, 1991, a punitive operation began in Vilnius. Army units and the Alpha Special Forces sent from Moscow, with the help of armored vehicles, tried to seize key sites in the capital, including the Republican Television Center and the building of the Supreme Council of Lithuania. To suppress the independence movement, however, in response to Moscow's actions, Lithuanians took to the streets en masse to defend the buildings. The democratic authorities of Lithuania called these events acts of occupation by Soviet military personnel on the territory of the Republic and formed the National Salvation Committee. Overall, the standoff in Vilnius lasted for 3 days. On January 13, as police and KGB special forces tried to seize the television tower, 14 civilians died and hundreds were injured. These events, which later became known as the January Assault, caused a wide international outcry and strengthened Lithuania's determination to seek recognition of its independence. Because blood was shed and international pressure mounted, the Soviet authorities backed down and halted the punitive operation. But the most interesting thing is that afterwards, none of the top officials dared to take responsibility. The Minister of Internal Affairs of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Boris Puga, and the Minister of Defense, Dmitry Yazov, assured everyone of their non-involvement. Gorbachev himself shyly stated that he supposedly knew nothing about this operation, and that he was only informed about it in the morning after the fact. Later he claimed that the Alpha fighters were supposedly shown a handwritten order in pencil, allegedly from him, which was then torn up so that all traces disappeared. A similar situation occurred in nearby Latvia at the same time as the events in Vilnius. On January 13, Soviet troops, including special-purpose mobile units, swept Riga, prompting the Latvian Popular Front to urge non-violent resistance. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Riga and barricades were built to protect key sites. The climax of these events was the Special Forces assault on the Latvian Ministry of Internal Affairs. Building on the night of January 25, people were killed, including 2 cameramen who were broadcasting live from the scene. 2 more civilians were killed in other locations. Facing massive resistance from the broad public, Moscow retreated by January 27. As in Lithuania, these repressions only increased the local population's desire to break from the hated Soviet regime. And on January 20, Latvians annually commemorate the Day of Remembrance for the defenders of the barricades. The first and last referendum after the bloody events in Lithuania and Latvia. The Soviet leadership did not dare to hold similar events in Estonia and backed down, remembering that there are more civilized and safer ways to solve problems. Moscow displayed rare generosity by allowing citizens to decide on preserving the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and for the first time in Soviet history, they held something that at least remotely resembled a democratic expression of will. On March 17, 1991, the first and, to jump ahead, the last all-union referendum was held. The public was asked to discuss the question of the continued existence of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a single state. The question was formulated as follows: do you consider it necessary to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics, in which the rights and freedoms of a person of any nationality will be fully guaranteed? And 76.4% of all those who voted gave an affirmative answer. It seems simple. The majority wanted to live in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Empire was supposed to remain unshakable, but was that really the case? As they say, the devil is in the details. First of all, it should be noted that the referendum was not held at all in 6 Union republics, in the 5 previously mentioned ones that were determined to leave the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and also in Moldova. While Moldovan authorities hadn't officially declared independence, they had effectively begun separating from the Soviet Empire. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova boycotted the referendum, so the real percentage of citizens supporting the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was much lower than the reported 76%. They simply did not vote, and accordingly, their opinion was not taken into account in the overall result. The second important feature was the convoluted and extremely cunningly disguised wording of the question itself. Moreover, it was blatantly manipulative. By supporting the preservation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, people voted for a version of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics that hadn't existed yet. They were voting for a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics in which the rights and freedoms of people of any nationality would be fully guaranteed. The renewal hadn't occurred when the vote happened. In short, rhetoric swayed the masses. It was the authorities' usual promise: you just vote in favor and someday we'll renew the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and make it better than it was. Supporters of preserving the Union were essentially voting for a pig in a poke. And most importantly, what actually determined such a high percentage of supporters of the Soviet Union was that the voting took place on the territory of Russia, or the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic as it was still officially called back then. Russians, except perhaps some minorities, supported preserving it. How could it be otherwise? Russian imperialism and Great Russian chauvinism still persist. Ukrainians, who have faced 4 years of liberation from Nazism through missiles, Shaheds, and deadly weapons, feel this personally. Most Russians have supported and will continue to support preserving and expanding their empire's territory, regardless of whether it is called a union or federation. It's kind of funny and cynical to ask a people who have conquered other nations, hey, how about we let them go free now? It's like holding a referendum in Britain in 1776 with the question, shall we recognize the independence of the American colonies that declared themselves the United States of America? Or maybe around 1820, to ask the Spanish how they feel about Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and other colonies becoming independent. What do you think the representatives of a people who for centuries were used to seeing themselves as dominant would say? Well, now let's turn to the numbers. 2 years earlier, in 1989, the last all-union census was conducted and the total population of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was almost 287 million people, with 147 million. So think about it. If the referendum had been held fairly in only the 14 Soviet republics, without the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, what would the voting result have been then? Personally, I think that 76 would have to be divided at least in half, if not more. And what happens next? This question can be answered easily. The Soviet government tried until the very end to do everything it could to preserve the Soviet Empire, even in a reduced, amputated form. Using the results of that referendum as cover, Gorbachev began attempts to revive the dying Union of Soviet Socialist Republics through negotiations, better known as the Novo-Ogaryovo process. However, it was never meant to be upgraded. Ahead lay the State Committee on the State of Emergency and the final collapse of the world's first socialist state. As for the actions of the Kremlin leadership, it can be stated unequivocally that in the situation that developed on the eve of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is collapse, they acted in the most foolish, selfish, and short-sighted way possible. Just like a bull in a china shop. Any countermeasure from Moscow ultimately led to the exact opposite result. And finally, I would like to quote the words of the former chairman of the KGB of Azerbaijan, Vagif Guseynov, who, in his memoirs, assessed the strategy of Gorbachev and his entourage towards national movements. in the following way: do nothing for prevention, allow events to escalate, then use insignificant forces to suppress them, fueling passions, and only then apply the harshest measures, thereby only further aggravating the situation. What else can be added here? As they say, checkmate. So, it was the leaders themselves who buried the Sovok first and foremost. That's all from me. Thanks everyone for watching. See you